When Mafia The Old Country dropped, it didn't just expand the world. In some ways, it rewrote how we've seen a lot of it. For the first time, we were given a glimpse into the past lives of names we thought we already knew, at least the basics of it. Sam Trapani is only a child in this game, but we get to form a very strong bond and firm understanding of who his father was. But later he becomes the enforcer of Ennio Salieri, who isn't directly seen or interacted with in any sort of way, but he does make a pretty small appearance in this game via a police report. And then there's Giuseppe Parlamentari, introduced in Mafia 2 as the best safecracker in Empire Bay, and of course the man who forged Vito Scaletta's discharge papers from the military. Each of these three are very important in their own right, but no return carried more weight than Leone Galante, and to a slightly lesser degree Frank Vinci. Leo's always stood apart in this series. He's the mentor, the consigliere, the quiet force behind so much of Empire Bay's criminal history. And while I'll be doing a full deep dive on the history of the Galante family as a whole, and of course retouching Leo's older video that I did in the past to now properly account for his origins, be sure to subscribe if you don't want to miss out on those videos. Today I wanted to address a single question that could stand out separate from those videos, and that's why didn't Leo ever take the throne for himself? Why didn't he become Don Galante? It's a question that becomes even more fascinating when you consider who he chose to serve. Frank Vinci, a man who once poured drinks in a bar owned by the Galantes, back when Leo's family held the power and Vinci was the one looking up to them. Before The Old Country, we had little idea what the balance was between the two of them, and if there was ever any kind of differences with how they interacted with each other or respected one another. But now that we do know, it forces us to look at the relationship in an entirely different light. What the real dynamic between Leo and Frank was, and why did Leo, with all the influence in the world, as he had immense amounts of influence, decided that being consigliere was enough for him? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this because I don't think the answer is as simple as look at what happened to his family. That's definitely the root of it, but I think there's other layers worth looking at when it comes to why Leo made that choice. And instead of starting with his personal background, I want to begin with the fundamentals of what it actually means to be a consigliere, and then compare that role to how it's been shown across the Mafia series, and how even in that role, Leo's incredibly unique. Now at the basics, the consigliere is considered just a right-hand man, but he's so much more than that. He's the trusted voice in the Don's ear, the one person in the family who can speak freely, even argue with the boss to make sure every move is airtight. By design, he's often a low-profile figure whom the Don trusts completely, who can also mediate disputes, meet with outsiders, and keep the family looking as legitimate as possible. Sometimes that means being the go-between with politicians or judges. Sometimes it means acting as the family's diplomat. And in the best cases, it means serving as the Don's second brain, testing ideas, finding weaknesses, keeping accurate accounts of the family's various businesses and rackets, both legal and otherwise, and ensuring nothing slips through the cracks. What makes the role so fascinating is the balance of power here. A consigliere doesn't command crews, he doesn't necessarily give orders directly, but he knows every secret the Don holds. If he ever broke that faith, he could destroy the family from the inside. Yet because of the respect the role carries, he's usually untouchable, even by rival families. In many ways, the consigliere is the family's insurance policy. A man with influence but without the same target painted on his back as the Don or an underboss, or the various capos that is beneath the underboss. And when you look at the Mafia games, you realize how rarely we've actually seen that role fully utilized. Across the whole series, there are really only 3 clear examples. Frank Coletti, who stood beside Don Salieri in the first game, Tino from Mafia The Old Country that just recently dropped, and then of course Leone Galante serving under Frank Vinci in Mafia 2. Other characters come close, such as Luca Guarino for Clemente and Eddie Scarpa for Falcone, but those were capos, not advisors. They enforced orders, they didn't challenge them. And then by the time we get to Mafia 3, the role has almost disappeared entirely. I don't even remember Sal Marcano being referred to or called as a Don, and that might have been very intentional because he leaned so heavily into the image of trying to separate himself from that world. He was very keen on making his businesses as legitimate as possible so that way he can cut off all of his criminal ties, primarily so that way he doesn't have to cut the commission in on any profits he's generating anymore. When we look at the three consiglieri we do see, each one operates in a completely different sort of way. Take Frank Galante, for example. He's very much the traditional right-hand man, the second brain working quietly besides Salieri. We don't really see him clashing with the Don, but we do see how important he is in keeping the family stable. Frank is the one who manages the books, keeps the accounts clean, and makes sure every dollar adds up. He's also the one advising Tommy, Paulie, and Sam whenever they're sent out on jobs, making sure they understand not just what needs to be done, but why it matters to protect the family and its assets. With Thomas in particular, Frank steps into almost a mentor-like role. He pulls him aside and warns him about his spending, reminding him that when guys get careless, people start to notice. And that kind of attention brings trouble. Trouble for Tommy, for Frank, and ultimately for Salieri himself. It's a good example of what a consigliere really does, not barking orders, not running crews, but quietly keeping the machine from breaking down, and even getting a little personal by essentially telling Tommy that, hey, if you keep your head on straight, you will be running the city one day. You will become your own Don because Paulie and Sam, the two people closest to you, aren't really cut out for that type of life. Tino, on the other hand, is a complete contrast. To him, Enzo is just another Caruso. Never truly trusted, always keeping him at arm's length, no matter what extent Enzo goes to in the name of the family. But within the Galante crime family, Tino is respected for exactly that. He seems to be unbearable to some as well, but at the core root of it, he is an old school enforcer, someone rooted in tradition and violence. Where Frank Galante acted as a stabilizer, a second brain for Salieri, Tino amplified Don Galante's work's instincts. And here's where the spoiler warning comes in. If you haven't finished Mafia The Old Country, maybe skip ahead and come back later. Because Tino takes things to an entirely different level. He personally tortures the father, uncovering the secret of Isabella's pregnancy and Enzo's plan to flee to the United States. In his letter back to Don Galante explaining everything that he discovered, thanks to the father revealing it, there's a sort of cold detachment in all of it, making it clear he has no objections whatsoever to whatever Galante decides to do next. Much of Tino's actions at the end of the game tied to Isabella and Enzo, I think, really highlight Tino at his core. Loyalty not really to the truth or even to strategy, but to Galante's rage. He never seemed to question orders, he only appeared capable of having second thoughts when it came to the idea of backing down or showing any sort of weakness on the table. And for Tino, that was never really an option. Leo, on the other hand, immediately stands out from the start. Even though we first meet him in prison, it's immediately clear he's not just another inmate. He's running things from the inside. The guards speak with him openly about the men under his protection, walking alongside him and treating him more like a colleague than an actual convict. And then there's Leo's cell. It doesn't even resemble a cell. Leo surrounds himself with comforts you'd expect in a home. A fully stocked kitchen, a couch, a desk, multiple chairs, dressers, bookshelves, even paintings on the walls. It's less a punishing space and more a private suite with it just bars as his actual door. And every piece inside of that cell is a reminder of the respect and authority he commands, which is influence that doesn't stop at the prison. Again, Leo had the legal connections to slash Vito's sentence, and the sway to vouch for him directly with the Falcone crime family, basically saying Vito has proven himself to be quiet, loyal, and a great earner. The time and work that he's done for me is more than enough to make me want him to join our family, but since you're already taken in his best friend Joe, why not initiate Vito at the exact same time as his best friend, together? As a quick side note with Leo's own history with the Falcone crime family, let's not forget Leo has a dark history tied directly to their rise as well. During the 1930s, as prohibition ended and illegal alcohol sales began to dry up, old sources of revenue vanished. And with less money to be made, tensions flared between the Vinci and then Moretti crime family, eventually boiling over into a 2-year bloody conflict over whatever scraps remained on how those two can make money. And it was Leo who played a decisive part in how that war ended. He worked very closely with Carlo Falcone, who was then one of Moretti's own capos. Galante would help Carlo and another man by the name of Steve Cohn plant a bomb in Moretti's car, killing him instantly and immediately bringing an end to the Vinci-Moretti war and the rise of the Falcone crime family that would inherit all of Moretti's existing operations. I don't want to directly imply that Vito's acceptance into the Falcone crime family was because of a debt owed to Leo or some favor that Leo called from way back when, but it does highlight the darker side of Leone Galante that I believe is often overlooked. Yes, he's feared, yes, he's respected, and yes, he respects the values and traditions that this type of life upholds, but at the same time, he's very level-headed and calculated, and seemingly a willingness to do whatever it took to end a war, no matter how dishonorable it was to, at the very least, have knowledge of a planned assassination of a Don about to take place, with that assassination coming from a well-placed knife in the back from someone directly underneath Moretti. I would say the killing of Don Moretti can also be tied back to Leo's own past, specifically to what he had already witnessed with his own family. He had seen firsthand the cost of sitting in that chair, of being the Don at the center of a major operation. The throne came with respect, but it also came with a target, one that claimed his own bloodline and left scars he never forgot. Watching Moretti's empire collapse and being directly involved in the act that brought it down would only reinforce that reason of staying in the shadows. The boss always bears the weight, and the boss is always the one marked for death. And that's a mentality that could have easily been hammered home by his own grandfather. For years, the story of the Vinci family's rise was told as a simple tale of two men arriving in America with nothing and building everything from the ground up. Frank Vinci was said to have wasted no time embedding himself within the Italian immigrant community, establishing extortion and smuggling rackets that formed the backbone of their growing power. Leone Galante, meanwhile, was seen as a steady strategist working behind the scenes, refining their operations and keeping the family's vision focused. Together, the two supposedly clawed their way up from the bottom, their big break coming in the early 1920s when they seized control of the Southport docks in Empire Bay. With Prohibition just beginning, that move turned smuggling into a fortune and cemented the Vinci name as one of the city's most powerful. Frank earned a reputation as a discreet, respectable Don, weaving alliances with politicians and power brokers, while Leo seemed to be more as an afterthought, a product of his moves behind the scenes, recognized as Vinci's quiet but brilliant right-hand man. Of course, Mafia The Old Country reframes all of that, though. We now know that Leo was never just some bright immigrant hustler who found his place once he landed in America. He was already operating as a quiet, level-headed consigliere long before he set foot within Empire Bay. In 1906, still a young man, Leo had established his own smuggling connections back in Sicily, connections that tied directly to Empire Bay, which involved whiskey shipments, counterfeit cash, even race cars. These were networks that traded seamlessly within the United States in exchange for cigarettes and eventually weapons. By the time they arrived in America, the two of these men were not starting from scratch. They were expanding on a foundation that Leo and his grandfather had already laid, amplifying the idea that Leo really was the strategist, the auxiliary brain, the one who saw the bigger picture and built structures others could only occupy. And that's why his power as consigliere was so different from Tino or Frank. He didn't grow into the role, he was born and molded by it. And considering he survived two very dangerous and bloody wars with the Spadaros, both eras costing him much of his family heritage. He lost his mom, his father, both his siblings, and ultimately his grandfather, who held the title of Don, possibly hammering home that it might just be better to be the one in the shadows. Speaking of which, if we look at how his grandfather ran operations as Don, we can see another layer of influence on Leo's outlook. Don Galante favored a more passive mediator's approach, always trying to keep the peace, always aiming for simple understandings, even willing to bend the knee for the sake of avoiding bloodshed. But that restraint ultimately led to his downfall. He was betrayed and killed by Baron Fontanella and Don Spadaro, a brutal reminder of what happens when passivity is mistaken for weakness. For Leo, that example may have reinforced the value of being the calm, level-headed voice within the room. The one who thinks first, negotiates when possible, and avoids reckless bloodshed. But it also comes with a critical lesson that must not be forgotten. Being calm doesn't mean being powerless. Force still has its place, but it has to be applied carefully and balanced with diplomacy. Michele's death pushed the next Don Galante to swing too far in the opposite direction, leaning into passivity to the point of paralysis. That too became a lesson for Leo. Learn from the mistakes of the past, but don't let fear, pain, or regret lock you into a single mode of leadership. You need to adapt, balance, and keep every option on the table open to you. Time and again, life in this world has proven one thing. Tomorrow is never guaranteed, especially for those sitting at the top. A Don's seat comes with power, but it also comes with a target, and enemies are always waiting for the chance to pull that trigger. Leo already had that power. Why take on the added danger of the title? Coming to the United States alongside his closest friend, Frank, it made sense to just let Frank wear the crown while Leo continued doing what he had always done best, guiding from the shadows. At the end of the day, Leo always carried the respect, the influence, and the connections of a Don, even if he never claimed the official rank, and that was ultimately his choice. From his seat as Consigliere, he was able to prevent all-out war with the Triads after Joe and Vito nearly ignited one. Both sides convinced the other was behind a supposed betrayal. Years later in the 1960s, Leo's standing was recognized yet again when he was chosen to act as messenger for the commission. By then, it wasn't a promotion so much as a natural expansion of what he had always been. The advisor, who had carefully cultivated a reputation and judgment that was trusted far above all others. In this entire series, Leo is the case of a man who managed to survive a life built on betrayals and bloodshed without being consumed by it. Thomas Angelo tried to walk away, to bury the life and acquire a fresh start, but in the end his past still caught up with him. Vito Scaletta clawed his way up, only to watch everything he built slip through his fingers while he couldn't protect what mattered most to him. Tino followed violence, wherever it led, loyal to the wrong men until cruelty became the only thing that defined him. Frank Coletti kept Salieri's house in order, but even he broke under the weight of it and tried to disappear. And the bosses fared no better. Salieri himself grew paranoid and reckless, his empire crumbling as the life he fought to hold on to finally closed in all around him, even becoming the exact person he described Marco Morello to be. Decades later, the Marcano family would follow the same pattern, grasping at legitimacy only to watch their empire collapse from within due to their own desperate efforts to get out of that life. Leo was different. He didn't run, he didn't lose everything, he didn't burn out in paranoia or arrogance. Every betrayal, as far back as in Sicily, every loss, every bloody war only seemed to strengthen his resolve, to clear his mind, not hold any grudges, and utilize it to become one of his greatest strengths. And instead of trying to escape that life, he bent it to his will, rising higher, becoming more respected, and somehow surviving long enough to outlast all of them. Thank you for sticking around to the very end. It really does mean a lot. I'm curious what you think about Luca Trapani, his position within the Torrisi crime family, and how things might have been differently had he survived. I do have another video coming out specifically on his death, but I do want to wait on major spoilers for the game right now. So subscribe for some future Mafia content, for analysis, breakdowns, and overall backstories. And a major shout out to my patrons, Daniel Homan, Konkin, and Ryan Smith. It's thanks to you that I'm able to spend so much time and go as detailed in these videos as possible. If you want to support the channel directly as well and get some behind the scenes or exclusive content on myself, the channel overall, and just how these videos are put together, then consider checking out the Patreon. Link is down in the pinned comment.